Welcome to this evening's edition. My name is Jemima Beerkes, your host for this evening's Evening Review show. Now, Namibia is becoming the hotspot for green hydrogen talk, and for us to help unpack this new energy source, we have in studio today David Jarret. He is an energy infrastructure specialist. David has also attended the Energy Dhaba in Cape Town last week. So he'll share with us some of his experience from there and also obviously what we need to know about the industry. Thank you for joining us on the show, David.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having us.
So let's jump right into it, David. It's good to have you on the show, obviously. So can you share with us a bit of your experience from Cape Town, the Indaba, and how much excitement was there in the newly found oil and gas discoveries?
Okay, that's kind of two things in one. So let's take the Indaba first. So the Energy Indaba itself is a coming together of CEOs, the makers and shakers of the industry and so on, and related primarily to energy, and of course the investment, so the financiers and so forth. And there was a great bit of excitement, if I can use that word that you just used, in the Indaba itself. And for the first 2 days in particular, there was what I would call open discussions, a lot of interactions and so on. And of course, Namibia had a pavilion there, and I'll allow NIPDB, of course, to talk about their approach. But Namibia was well represented. And for me, who has been attending the Indaba since 2009, it was quite refreshing to see Namibia's presence and the way that Namibia put its stamp on the event. So that was one of the things. In terms of how the Namibia was represented, I also give kudos to the NIPDB team and also to the various institutions, and I hope I don't forget any of them, such as MME, NamPower, NamCore, and so on and so forth, because I don't want to get into the full list of it. So I don't think there was anyone who had paid attention to the Indaba who left without having an opportunity to interact with the various entities. And so the government, in essence, we could say showed up, and showed up properly. Now, I guess a lot of the burning questions that still exist for people are we ready in terms of, you know, the new oil find, hydrogen, and quite a few of the other things that Namibia is pushing towards. Now, in terms of the new oil find, I would say that it's not the first. It's something that I've commented on before. So it's not the first oil find now. So, and if we look at it from a fossil fuel perspective, it's actually refreshing that we have something new after kudu gas.
Yes.
Because we had kudu gas and then we had this long, I would call it menopausal pause before anything happened. And then we found ourselves with last year 2 finds, this year another additional find, so now we have 3. And I think the same questions that were raised last year are the same questions that need to be answered this year. 1, what are we going to do? 2, is it going to change our economic status in the short term, medium or long term? Are the institutions ready to deal with it? And I think that's where I'd leave it.
So you said there was quite a bit of engagement, talks, real talk there. Could you share with us, what do you think are the lessons that Namibia can learn from these countries that were represented there that's already in this business?
Okay, so in terms of the oil and gas itself, because oil and gas is a separate issue from the overall energy issues that were dealt with at the Indaba, the lessons to be learned, I think, were known even before the Indaba. You know, you need to have, for example, a good sovereign wealth fund in place. You need to have a good policy that deals with the sovereign wealth fund. You need to have a clear understanding, are you going to be part of the value-added process, which is basically refining and looking at pharmaceuticals and so on. And no, I don't think the Indaba itself answered all of those questions, to be fair. But they are general questions that we still need to respond to. I think it's in the public domain that my comment is that in light of the fact that Namibia is a small economy, not to say we can't sell petrol and diesel to others, in light of the fact that we're a small economy, with the fact that there is a push to get rid of internal combustion engines, which are the engines that we get in our vehicles today, within 2035, they would be banned basically from a manufacturer's perspective. And we would take roughly until, let's say, 2030, 2032, even if we started today with an oil refinery for it to be ready for us to be producing fuel. We'd be producing fuels for engines that in 3-5 years will no longer be there. And these type of investments, and which is something else, I think sometimes it's a discussion that's needed. These type of investments need a long run for them to pay back and be worthwhile. So us investing in a oil refinery today, and there'll be those who say security of supply and other issues, but you make this major investment at a time when we could do it more schools, hospitals, whatever, and you make this sort of investment on a resource that within a few years you won't really be seeing the demand for it, hopefully. I think is kind of a lost cause, but the studies haven't yet been done. I'm sure the state will have some form of study that will look at some of these issues, and then hopefully common sense will prevail. That's my view.
So let's build right on that, on your
Sure.
response. Yes, it comes at a time that Namibia really can't prioritize an oil refinery or any sort of infrastructure of that magnitude. So then comes the issue of how will Namibians benefit then if investors come and they invest here. The Energy Minister, Mr. Tom Alwendo, recently said that Namibia is looking at ways to make sure Namibians benefit beyond just royalties and tax. And some of these are the joint venture approach. However, we've seen in the past, in the fishing industry and the construction industry, that joint venture is not necessarily the answer for value addition. We've seen people selling off their share in the venture, and then only one person actually get this value from this. So as an economist, how do you think can Namibia make sure this works, for this joint venture approach really works this time around?
Okay, so my take and view on this, and I suppose the Honourable Minister hasn't asked me for the advice, but my take on it is that Namibia should take a step back, and I think the colleagues are actually doing that. But anyway, be that as it may, take a step back and look at what really worked in the past, because not everything was a total failure. Yes, in terms of what it is. And so sometimes it has more to do with controls and the way things are implemented. So if you rush something, you probably get it wrong. You trip, you fall, as they would say. But you walk in a timeless fashion and you move towards the goal that you have in hand. So I think we are very clear on what the goal is. There needs to be equity, there needs to be, and that is why I mentioned the Sovereign Wealth Fund, because that is one of the areas that is used. Because if you look, for example, at the Nordic countries, they've used their sovereign wealth funds. And we must understand that there is life after oil, because it is a non-renewable resource. So it will deplete over time. And as it depletes, it becomes more valuable. As it depletes, it becomes more of an aggression factor, if we can call it that, and if there's such a term. And you tend to find that we'll then be saying, can we find more? Can we find more? So we need to clearly understand what it is we're trying to achieve. Now, one of the things that I do know is that there is perception, there is misconception, and there is the reality. And I think what is happening is because of the very technical nature of a lot of these things. There's the legal framework, there is the economic, there's the financial, there's the technical nature of the activities involved, there's the value chains to understand. When they are not explained fully, people get the wrong impression. Yes. And also when you start to mention numbers, now for me, as I say to my students many times when I'm lecturing, that I personally don't understand any number beyond 1 billion. it's not really true, but it's not a number that I bandy around. I'm more talking about $100, $1,000, $5,000, and so on in my day-to-day life. So for me now to be starting to say, okay, this thing is 26 billion, and then if you look at it from another 56%, it'll grow to be another 70 billion, and we want 30 billion there, and so on. This is what is exactly happening. People are answering the immediate question and not the long-term view of what should be taking place. And I think this is one of the things that I would strongly advise from a personal perspective, that the public be brought on board. So something needs to be done so that people stop getting misperceptions, people stop picking at paragraphs on statements, and then things can be understood. Now, the real meat of the matter is, for us to be able to ensure that we have an equitable distribution, we first need to agree what is equity. So what would be an equitable distribution? Is it that Namibia is supposed to own 80%? Are we supposed, because I've heard these sort of things, we only have 10%. But nobody looks at the liability that comes with the 10% that you do have. Or how is it structured? How do you encourage investors, knowing that there's competitors next door? So you have neighboring countries regardless. Who are your competitors? How do you attract someone with a value proposition that is not detrimental to you, but at the same time worthwhile and meaningful, so that you don't chase the investor away? So we need to have these, what I call, managed approaches. And I'm not saying the government doesn't have it or that is in need of it, coming from the likes of me, but we need these managed approaches. And I would caution sometimes that we look at things in a silo fashion. So for example, if we just look at the oil and we think, yeah, but oil gives us petrol, oil gives us diesel, oil gives us grease, it gives us this. And then we get caught up in a $20 billion piece of infrastructure that doesn't return $20 billion, in essence becomes like a donation. or you get where I'm going with this.
Yes, absolutely.
And so these are the sort of questions that need to be answered by those that hopefully fully understand how these things work.
Now, David, we need to go for a break, but before that, I want you've just talked about misconceptions, interpretation, and not understanding fully. You have mentioned a word, a phrase, it can become an aggression factor. Please explain that briefly before we go for a break.
All right, so very quickly, what will happen is that if you find that it becomes something that a lot of people are chasing, then humanity is well known. It loses its senses because it's looking at the reward. And so as it becomes more valuable, it becomes more of a center point for people to chase after. And that's quite frankly what you call an aggression factor.
Thank you for clarifying.
Thank
so
you.
we're going for a quick break. We'll be back.
Sure,
we'll be
thanks.
back in a minute.
NMH at 1 brings you news from all corners of Namibia. NMH at 1 aims to reach viewers countrywide who are interested in current affairs in a short and sweet format. This show is broadcasted on NTV, 1up2.com, and cross-shared on the following Facebook platforms: The Republican, Algemeine Zeitung, Namibian Sun, Namibia Media Holdings, Irongo, and Vindic Express. To share your news or advertise on this platform, contact NMH1 at synergy.com.na. NMH at 1, your lunchtime news companion.
Welcome back. Now we have in studio David Jarret, an energy infrastructure specialist. If you've just joined us, he's talking to us about the oil discoveries off the coast of Namibia, and obviously the green hydrogen project that is about to take off soon. Before we went on a break, you said a number of things, one of them being controls that need to be in place. Now, David, what are your thoughts on the fact that Namibia has yet to promulgate a synthetics energy legislation or policy governing this industry?
Okay, so one of the things that I would say first and foremost is that policy development takes time. And I also referred earlier to the fact that when you have to deal with new, nascent industries, new industries and so on, then new challenges arise. Namibia, for example, has had to deal with, over the last 15 years or so, the influx of solar equipment within the industry. So you still find that you have various policies. But all is not lost, and I'll tell you why I say that. Normally you can find parallels in existing systems. So for example, there is already an energy policy. There is already an energy law. Yes. Be it the Electricity Act or be it the Petroleum Act and so on and so forth. So, with coal mines prevailing, you can find parallels coming from it, because we handle currently liquid petroleum gas, LPG. And although one can say that hydrogen is more dangerous, it's more explosive, and so on and so forth, it is still a gas. And it is still a gas that is operating within the energy sector. So there are certain things that could be co-opted on how LPG is transported, for example. Those could be tightened up and so on and so forth. You also have rules around where that can be stored. There's only a certain, for example, within our houses, we're only supposed to have a certain amount. If you do have it, it's supposed to be in a certain place. You're supposed to be in a certain enclosure, so on and so forth. The same thing will happen with hydrogen, of course. And so, although we don't yet have those laws, and quite frankly, we can't just pick one up off the shelf and say that we have it, there are, as I said, the mechanism for us to quite quickly start to look at a base law. Yes. And that is what my understanding is, that is being developed as we speak.
So you're an economist, you're not a political analyst, but I would like to indulge you. I would like you to indulge me on this.
Can I just pause you there? And I'm going to take the cheeky pause and say, I always remind people what the president reminded. I remember him saying that in my presence: politicians are politicians, technocrats are technocrats. So I'm just putting that rider out there. I am not a politician.
Yes, of course. So, David, or some of the things that investors look at when they come to a country to exploit resources,
okay, yes, you could tell from my eye that yes. But when they want to explore,
yes, when they want
for
to
explorations,
yes, yes, is political stability and certainty. So now the fact that we have elections in the next year, we have there's going to be a change of power, obviously. A new president is going to come into the office, and then the laws also not concluded yet. These are all issues of uncertainty. Then also the content, the local content policy is also not concluded yet. These are definitely issues that can make it very difficult for investors to know what they're getting themselves into, especially about that 10%. Some people are pushing for something else. So now you're coming to Namibia while these things are about to be concluded. When you are here, Namibia is going to say, well, we want, the law is going to dictate 50%. So what do you make of that at this point?
Okay, again, sometimes a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. And for me, I'm not so scared in terms of that, and I'll tell you why. First and foremost, we have a number of acts that deal with foreign investment, regulations and acts and so on. We also have signed on to a number of international treaties that determine how funds flow and things along that line. The Bank of Namibia has announced quite recently that it is trying its endeavor best to ensure that we're not grey listed as well, as has happened to our neighbor, without calling the name. So you can see that there are certain things in place that give surety. The other thing that I'll say is that there are certain parties, such as, for example, the German government and so on, that have shown keen interest in supporting Namibia in a number of ventures. And so what you tend to find is that if certain parties are in play and have provided support, it gives an indication to investment.
Yes.
And so what I see is the reverse. I see increased investment coming, or the interest, not the actual money, but increased investor interest in Namibia taking place instead of the reverse. Now, I think the real question we should be asking, how quickly can those be materialized into impactful
Yes.
investments. And then it goes back to your original question as to how equitable that will be. And I think that is the control that I'm talking about. That we need to examine that investors do not get the opportunity to, in essence, strip. And now I'd go to what you were trying to say there, but to strip the country of its resource, and by the time we wake up, it's gone.
Yes.
And we have not benefited in the way that we should have. And I think that is the control that needs to be in place. Now, what I do know is the Ministry of Finance has also made certain adjustments. So it's now starting to look at, for example, how goods are valued, how that value is transferred, what is exported versus what's imported, and so on and so forth, and then use that to look for a balance within tax sheets. So I think that all the pieces are there, and I'm just waiting to see how those pieces come together and make the whole. But I personally, if I was to advise an investor now, I would not have political risk, and that's what it's known as. I would not have political risk as one of the high. If anything, I think what I would probably flag here, and Honourable Minister of Finance, don't be upset with me for saying this, I would rather flag the Rand Namibian dollar parity as one. At what point will that ever break, and are there moves afoot to break it? That would be more something that I would be looking at, and the fact that the ZAR is now from a grey-listed country, will that foreign exchange risk be a risk that we have to take on board?
As well.
Yes.
So let's move on to the green hydrogen.
Sure.
There's a feeling among some people that Namibia is not moving fast enough to create a green hydrogen industry. What do you make of these feelings?
Funny enough, I'll throw back an earlier question about safety around the product, and is there a synthetic law? So I think that the pace that you move is a pace that's normally driven by commercial interests. So for example, I go back to the solar industry. A lot of the changes in the solar industry came because the private sector was driving it. And what you will find is if the private sector, because in the background they're doing analysis and so on, and they're looking at rates of return, profit, and they're driven by that. And if the private sector stops turning up on our shores asking, Minister, can I meet with you? Mr. President, can I meet with you? And hopefully soon it'll probably be Madam President or whatever. And I hope I didn't get into political trouble there. But if people stop asking you about something, then you have a problem. Right now, there's a lot of people asking, there's a lot of buzz, there's a lot of activity, and it therefore means there's some form of interest. People see that opportunity coming their way, and therefore they want to be part of it. And so that gives me encouragement, and that is what I would say in terms of that. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't hurry up and try and get something, and I did mention earlier that it is important for you to have a base law at least in place. So for example, we have the 10% that's bandied around and discussed. That's for another day. We then also have to have some law in place that says, okay, if you want to be involved in the synthetic fuels, these are some of the things you need to do, and over time we will revisit and
so we have to wrap up. So very briefly, now I'm coming to you in your capacity as energy infrastructure specialist. You've also mentioned it earlier, the risk of leakages when it comes to green hydrogen, for instance. And now, obviously, with oil, there's also the potential risk of spills. So what could you share with us if there are any latest technological innovations in the storage of energy and safe transportation?
I'm going to do the reverse and say to everyone and remind people that throughout the 1960s, and yes, I'm old, throughout the 1960s, space travel was driven by hydrogen and oxygen mix because it's one of the most efficient energy carriers. It therefore shows that the technology for containment of hydrogen has been around. I think one of the real problems that society faces is that it never has a technological challenge. It has a financial and economic challenge. How expensive is it to build a containment that keeps the hydrogen? So is somebody going to give you a cheap container and that's going to explode and create that sort of problem? So the technological advances as they're occurring right now are quite good in terms of dealing with that. We now have, for example, hydrogen trucks. There's a hydrogen haulage truck at the mine, I think it's in Mpumalanga for Anglo-American and so on. So these things are operating around us and the tests are ongoing. And I think in reality, if I must quickly say this, I think that the push to have hydrogen in everyone's car might not be the best move because of, you know, the sort of containment that are required and the cost of that. But hydrogen can be used in a much smaller fashion to run the hydrogen electric cells. And I think that is where society might be moving to. And as I said, private investors will show us where to go because the money always follows where it needs to be.
Money must just follow. Thank you very much for joining us
Yes.
on the show, David.
It has been a pleasure, and as always, you know, we're available.
Okay.
Always.
Thank you for joining us. Until next time.
Thank you very much.